Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. Our webinar today will show you how leading organizations are using unstructured data to stay ahead of emerging threats. My name is Lisa, and I represent Logon Software. Our company is a Silobreaker partner. Logon has been operating since 1993, primarily in Asia, with local offices in key locations and strategic channel partnerships in others. Our focus is on cybersecurity, and we offer training and technical implementation of leading cybersecurity solutions. Logon is a value-added partner for Silobreaker and complementary solutions that address vulnerability management for both web applications and the IT infrastructure. Logon also offers additional expertise in mitigating threats from third-party applications on websites. Our professional services team offer VAPT services, leveraging both manual and automated testing methods. With the pandemic still affecting businesses and people working from homes, we're also seeing a huge increase in interest for our data loss prevention, multi-factor authentication, and user access management solutions. So do visit our website for more information. So today I am excited to have with us Mr. Shah Rahman, Client Director at Silobreaker. Shah will be sharing with us everything you need to know about using unstructured data to stay ahead of emerging threats. Before I pass the mic to Shah, I would encourage you to feel free to ask questions using the chat option, and we will do our best to address all your questions. Shah?
Thank you so much for that, Lisa. And I'd like to actually start by wishing everyone that has joined us on the call today very good afternoon. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I'd actually also like to extend my special thanks to my partners at Logon for giving me this platform to deliver this webinar and inviting me to be able to share my experiences and the experiences of my company with you. My name is Shah. I head up our business efforts at Silobreaker for the Asia Pacific region. I actually also see all of our business efforts and oversee the efforts in Middle East and Africa and as well. I've been with Cyberbreaker since 2013. I was actually a part of our emergence into the cybersecurity space, but as a company, we've been doing this since 2005. Where we're helping intelligence professionals all across the world for multiple different areas. As Lisa mentioned, our topic of discussion today is on how we can use unstructured data to stay ahead of emerging threats. But first, a bit of information about Cyberbreaker for those of you who are not familiar with us. We are a Swedish-English company, and we build intelligence products for the purpose of making sense of the overwhelming amount of data that is out there on the web. We're headquartered here in London, which is where I am based, and all of our business efforts actually come from the London office, but our engineering team actually works out of Stockholm, which is our second office. Our founders come from a variety of backgrounds, including military intelligence, financial services, and data and text mining technology. While the use cases our customers present us with can vary from cyber to geopolitical or corporate risk and so on and so forth, our technology is built to support the human analysis that is required for detecting, predicting, and responding to threats, incidents, developments, or opportunities with a specific focus of making sense of that unstructured data set. And on the subject of unstructured data, estimates suggest that 80 to 90% of all the data that is out there in the world is actually in this format. And by definition, this means there is a huge amount of unorganized and relatively text-heavy information out there. Needless to say, this information is extremely complex to process, search, and understand. But understand it we must, right? Because it is within this type of data where threat intelligence can really be found. From a security perspective, going back to the cyber world, the evidence for this is actually all around us. These are the types of sources that are commonly relied upon by intelligence professionals within our space for their information, because this is where you will find threat actors specifically talking about their target lists, their motivations, and as well as their tactics, techniques, and procedures that they will be using for relatively unsophisticated operations using paid sites and social media. So if we spend a little bit of time looking at the types of attacks that we see today, they are unsophisticated. They're tried, they're tested. Then there's nothing new really happening. We're seeing old vulnerabilities being exploited, the same stories being told over and over again, but they are hiding behind this layer, which is very difficult for us to penetrate. And especially when it comes to, let's say, darknet forums in particular, this is where you will find cyber criminals discussing new vulnerabilities and sharing proof of concept codes from the likes of GitHub, as well as news outlets and again, social media. Within these sources, you'll also see the world being monitored 24/7 with various commentary and reporting on brand sentiment, the reputations of a company, as well as other political biases. From the eyes of the intelligence professional, having visibility to these sources should be a mandatory part of the overall threat intelligence program. And I guess at this point, it's actually worth mentioning that the definition of threat intelligence itself is becoming more and more open to interpretation. It means different things to different people. This map that you see on your screen, hopefully, is not something that you can get from Google. It's actually based on our own experiences dealing with these large multinational organizations and the various use cases that they present Silobreaker with. Traditionally, threat intelligence has tended to be confined within an organization's perimeters, where security professionals were tasked with setting up things like firewalls and antivirus tools and so on and so forth. But this really is an intelligence. I mean, if anything, it's actually quite academic. So this naturally then progressed to these professionals monitoring things like IOCs and enriching the IOCs. But really, in order to be more strategic with their threat intelligence, security professionals needed to understand things like TTPs, not just malicious IPs or anything like that, because that's how you prevent threats instead of actually just mitigating them. We can spend a lot of time looking at feeds of IOCs and looking at vulnerabilities and patching them and sort of blocking them at a firewall level. But unless we understand the reasons to why these actually exist in the first place and the original motivations, we will never get to a point where we are actually fully protected. In essence, taking a more holistic view of the overall threat landscape requires more than just IOCs, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And that includes things like monitoring your assets or understanding how a company's or country's reputation may prompt attacks. And that's actually a much more rounded strategic threat intelligence effort. So in our experience, this is how the threat landscape actually looks like today. The further you move away from your technical perimeter, the more you will have to rely on this unstructured data set. And it's not linear in any way. The field of view actually opens up more and more the further and further you move out. So it gets more noisy, it gets more opinionated, and it just becomes much more increasingly difficult to qualify and make sense of. To be able to slice through this data, you need the right tools to really understand what hacker groups are talking about and what they would be using. And to make sense of this type of data, we use technology to help support the human analysis that is actually required to interpret, understand, and really impact how the world actually works around us. So here is a quick outline of the technology that Silobreaker has built as a measure of dealing with unstructured data in an efficient manner. As a starting point, I guess access to information is where it all begins. So we must make available for ourselves data from multiple types of sources that I've actually mentioned so far. We do this in 18 different languages, and not only because of our global customer base, but because you will find information that is very pertinent and very relevant in many different languages. There's no standardized way of communication. So if you're a Russian threat actor, you're obviously speaking in Russian. So visibility to these types of sources is extremely important. But what it does mean is that the big data problem is compounded because we are indexing over 1 million sources, and that means several hundred thousands of articles every day that we are being exposed to on a real-time basis. So it's a lot of information for us to process. But what we then do is fuse these sources together and index them with a focus on comprehensive entity extraction. So identifying the snippets within the data set that is really necessary for us and allows us to cut through the noise and really get to what we need to know. And that really is the heavy lifting that intelligence professionals benefit from, because the alternative to this is actually to manually sift through all of this content and create these connections through brain power as opposed to computer power. Now, allowing technology to do that heavy lifting of finding structure within unstructured data, it actually allows us to use, general conventional visualizations to easily monitor and analyze the output. And then we can spend more time in decision making. I think too much time is being wasted talking, too much time is being wasted trying to find the information of which IOCs to focus on, or which vulnerabilities to patch, or which threat actors are relevant, and not enough time is being spent on actually actioning those. So ultimately, I guess what we do, what everyone does, right? We produce a means to disseminate this content to the key stakeholders so that they can take action, and we do this in multiple different ways, like email alerts and API exports and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's get into the subject matter at hand, and I guess we're trying to identify a way of understanding how we can use external unstructured data to understand what the cyber threat landscape really looks like when considering the indirect threats to our organization. And as part of this, we see very typical questions, and with the evolving roles of security and intelligence professionals, one of those common questions can be to ask what the climate surrounding our business is really looking like. And that's actually simple enough to define a security posture from, because we can look at the geopolitical climate and that is surrounding our organization, given our areas of operation and our locations of interest and where we have assets and so on and so forth, and ask the typical questions that we see in the news today. But when it comes to large multinationals in particular, the climate is actually very much a global one. So the immediate problems as a result of that becomes identifying what information is relevant to us as that organization, based on our areas of operation, as mentioned before. But this actually naturally enters us into the big data problem, a problem that's seen the world sort of flip on its head, right? Because it's no longer a case of information is power. It still is, but the problem is that information is now available and easily accessible by everyone, whether you're paying for a feed or you're actually just doing a standard search engine query. So now the real problem is being able to process this information with respect to the time sensitivities that are actually associated to it. How do we use this vast amount of information that is available to us to benefit us as opposed to hinder us, and ultimately identify the cyber elements within it? So in response, threat intelligence teams monitor multiple trusted sources of information for the purpose of identifying connections back to their organization. And the hope then is that they will be able to equip stakeholders with the visibility they need in order to make the decisions that are required to ensure ongoing security in an organization. I've highlighted this solution for a reason, because I want to scrutinize it just a little bit, because its effectiveness becomes increasingly difficult to manage as a company continues to grow. Sort of the purpose why everyone's in business, right? To see their company evolve and get bigger and more profitable and so on and so forth. But as part of that, if we assume this to be a typical large multinational company, here are some of the potential avenues of threats to consider. Each one of these areas is a target of an attack, and therefore news around them actually needs our attention. We need to be monitoring what's being said around all of these individual resources, all of these different units, and everything that actually comes out of it. In other words, as a company grows, they open themselves up to more ways of being targeted. So how can the solution that I've highlighted at the top scale effectively? Well, the idea that we will continue to rely on our manual abilities to scan our trusted sources of information without technological intervention really isn't that realistic. It becomes a major problem. So the big question then becomes, how can technology be used to make sense of unstructured data in order for companies to better understand their security posture and threat landscape? How do we find the pertinent information that links back to our organization in terms of all of those cybersecurity entities? Among many things, technology equips us with the ability to leverage external unstructured web data from hundreds of thousands of sources all at once. And that really is a very major point, the ability to have everything in one place, the ability to query everything collectively and standardized approaches. And this makes it possible to track activity around the various areas of our business. What we can also benefit from are the various analytical tools that actually allow our teams to be able to pick up on things like unusual reporting, or understanding geopolitical trends, or cyber and physical security threats, which I guess are separate entities that can merge together, and we've seen that happen in many cases. As well as the political instabilities across news, blogs, feeds, forums, open and deep and dark web sources. And we can also benefit from extremely powerful search capabilities, which are needed to cut through millions of documents to extract relevant information on threats to things like business operations. And these findings are often extremely time consuming. But at the same time, they're also time sensitive, and everything needs to be reported on quickly and easily to our stakeholders. Now, with that in mind, I'd like to walk through an example scenario, and I'm going to apply my own technology to show you how we would do it. The query that I'm really going to be working with is how can we identify a link between some of the geopolitical news and events within our region and the potential cyber threats that can impact our organization directly as a result of it. So I want to focus on something that is actually quite relevant to the Asia Pacific at the moment, and work with a superpower like China, right? And the sentiments around it are not really the topic of this discussion, but we can certainly look at the tensions between China and the neighboring countries within the Asia Pacific. I feel this topic is very current, it's very relevant, and if we ask the questions from a general sense, then it's actually quite easy to grasp the importance of it. So in querying something like this, we need a very powerful search and retrieve mechanism. So the way we would actually lay out this query in Cyberbreaker looks something like what you can see at the top of your screen there. And immediately, the result of this is something like this. So I guess the immediate benefit is being able to see everything in one screen. From a first glance, everything here seems somewhat relevant. And I guess thanks to that powerful filtering capability, we're able to really cut out the noise. But the one thing it doesn't do is change the amount of content there is to consume, because we're still seeing over 6,700 results. So as a retaliation to that, we have a box here, hopefully you can see on your right-hand side. We call this the in focus section. And what that does is it actually identifies the most relevant areas within the story for us to be able to use to our advantage. And the key advantage of this section is that we can start with a very broad query and identify the most relevant aspects of that query by extracting the key terms within that data. And a lot of tools do this. You will see, the stories are being tagged, and then if a story has some thing to do with geopolitics, you will find that tag. If it has something to do with a person, you'll find that tag. And then if it has something to do with cyber, you'll find those tags. I think the key thing to mention here is that we do it automatically. And that's why immediately there is no analyst input. It's done in a very quick and efficient manner. And straight away, we can start to see cyber terminology pop up. So in this case, there is doxing over there. From there, I guess one of the things that we can do is start to pick and choose what is pertinent to us. So I'm just going to take a couple of examples over here, use the likes of pro-democracy in China and a location. And then what we can do is start building a query that we actually want to pay attention to and spend some time on. And then I guess we finally end up with the content we really want to spend time on, which also happens to be a much more manageable amount. In this case, we're dealing with 28 documents versus the 6,700 that we started with. The cyber terminology is something that we'll take a look at shortly, but this is very crucial in the beginning stages of our journey into dissecting unstructured data for intelligence purposes. This is where a lot of professionals become unstuck. It's very off-putting in nature. You search what you think is a very specific query, and you get hit with 6,700 results. But persist is something that we must actually do, because we know the value of this type of data set in order to stay ahead of emerging threats. And thanks to technology, that problem now is somewhat negated. And so instead, we can actually spend time building situational pictures and make our results much easier to access as and when we need them. And since we were exposed to cyber entities, there's no reason to why we should stop there. And we can actually add a section that looks for the cyber news that is related to the original query. So this is actually what we're able to do when we dive into the unstructured world: identify connections that are not so obvious. We started with a query that was looking at geopolitical analysis, and now we have ended up with a section on the same query that is looking for cyber-related terminology, in this case, there is quite a bit of visibility to APT groups. And all of a sudden, we broadened our horizons to incorporate this link between a global event and its cyber connotations. I guess by using technology, we've been able and equipped with the ability to identify these links extremely quickly. And it actually takes even less time now to make a shift in our focus and start investigating just that cyber portion. So if I bring that into the screen at the moment and actually apply an additional layer of analytics to it, we end up with several other visualizations that allow us to begin our deep dive into things like related threat actors. So I wanted to know about tensions within the APAC region. And on the top left, I have a bunch of threat actors that seem to be trending alongside my original query. We see a lot of APT groups that we are very familiar with. In the bottom left section, we can also see a bunch of malware that could actually be linked to the APT groups. If not directly, they certainly are indirectly. And just to show you that link, I've actually also included a trend analysis tool at the top right, which is actually showing me the peaks and troughs of content from a tensions perspective. So whenever content comes in talking about these tensions in my original query, I can also see somewhat of a correlation, and a very strong correlation with regards to APT activity. Of course, we're now talking about state-sponsored threat activity, so it's not, I guess, it's not so much of a surprise that is the route that we're taking from a cyber perspective. And since we are making that shift, there is no reason to why we can't use Cyberbreaker's In Focus widget to get visibility to the types of attacks that are being employed, the types of threat actors that are relevant, the types of vulnerabilities that we're seeing, things like IP addresses and hash files and so on and so forth. And now that our initial investigation has revealed where we should look, we can start building our intelligence portfolios with the aim of understanding what we should actually do. So this is another widget that we use to extract from the data set the various different cyber terminology that is in this case related to APT groups. So you can see that we are maintaining the same query at the top, but now we can start going into the cybersecurity world. And from here, we can start to build action lists that would serve as new queries to help us determine what we should prioritize. These lists that we are now building actually serve multiple purposes. The immediate aspect of it is a heat calculation that gives us an indication of what we should prioritize. So if I'm focusing on these 21 threat actors, where should I start? Where should I start my investigation? Who should I learn about first? Or how should I assign it to my teams? And who should I dedicate to focus on things like APT10 and TA505 and so on and so forth? Now, the reason to why this is ranked in this way is because we're focusing on unusual attention. So this is not your conventional mechanisms of trending. But just as easily, we can actually use this list for filtered purposes. So when we actually do that and ask additional questions in other tools, we end up producing different situational pictures that seem to tell us something different. So on the top left side, we're actually looking at where these APT groups are actually active, or where this list of threat groups is active and where they're popping up in terms of activity. And on the bottom left of your screen, you can see associations with other terminology. So at any point, I'm able to identify the links between a vulnerability and a malware, and the relationship of that malware with the threat actor as well. I guess it's worth mentioning that there is no manual intervention here. Everything you see is on-the-fly link analysis. It is evidence-based, so we really are letting the data do the talking. But it may even be worth putting all of this in a dashboard of its own. So I really wanted to show you how we can go from something that is very non-cyber to something that is now somewhat directly cyber focused, even though it has geopolitical connotations around to it, which is interesting. We started with the questions of the cyber connotations of the geopolitical happenings around us, and now we're talking about the geopolitical connotations of the cyber happenings around us. So this dashboard, or this situational picture that I've created, actually now looks at those state-sponsored threat actors, because it was so obvious to us that it is APT groups that we must now look at. And now what actually happens is we are allowing technology to start asking questions on our behalf. So we start with a question, and now technology takes over and says, these are the other questions that you may need the answers to. You can consider these sub-questions to our original query. But at the same time, I'm able to intervene at any point and ask additional questions of my own. For example, I can see that at the very top, we're looking at Lazarus Group as one of the trending threat actors. By the way, just a sort of side note, in this case, we are monitoring China, North Korea, Russia. If I was to take a full screenshot, then you would see us monitoring every different type of APT group. And just sectioned across different countries. But in this case, if I see Lazarus Group is trending at the very top, Silobreaker is suggesting to me that this should be a priority for me. I guess we can ask the question as to why. And here we can see the answer, a link between Lazarus Group and the several countries, actually, including Hong Kong. We can also see South Korea, Russia, Germany, Argentina, and the United Kingdom as well. It's actually an article that is commentating on phishing attacks linking back to other major attacks on these types of countries. So the link there is actually quite obvious. But we can now switch our focus and take a look at Lazarus Group, since we know that this is something that we must be interested in. So why not look at the activities around Lazarus Group in general? In this case, what we'll be doing is we'll be using that powerful search and retrieve mechanism that we have at our hand to be able to analyze the behaviors of this particular threat actor. So we're taking the MITRE ATT&CK framework and using that entire framework as a filter to see what Lazarus is doing from the perspective of tactics and techniques. What stages is it in? And when was it mentioned within these stages? And at any point, what we can do is we can actually click on any of these techniques. So we can take brute force as an example and start to see what the data is telling us now. So we can see lots of activity around COVID-19 and vaccines. I guess even one of the things that I've highlighted on here is a ransomware that just pops up at me as something that is actually being used as part of that stage of attack by Lazarus Group. So before digging any deeper, I just want to actually spend a moment recapping where we started and how we got to where we got to. We had the question that is very obvious to anyone within the Asia Pacific region. What is the geopolitical landscape around us? And the example I used was China, simply because it is a global superpower. And I wanted to monitor tensions between China and its neighboring countries. And I guess we can flip it and look at the reverse. Maybe we want to look at the tensions of Hong Kong with its surrounding countries, or South Korea or Australia, and so on and so forth. From there, I was able to identify multiple different stories, some geopolitical, some physical. But in this case, we also identified a bunch of cyber-related stories that was going down the route of APT monitoring and really knowing the activities of these APT groups and how they are thinking, and how they are sort of behaving. We then identified that one of the most problematic APT groups within that region that we must pay attention to is Lazarus Group, which is, of course, a North Korean APT group. And then from there, we ended up dissecting Lazarus in terms of what the data within this unstructured world is suggesting to us. And using technology, we were able to identify each of the different stages that Lazarus Group is in at, and what it means from a tactics and techniques perspective. And then we get visibility to Ryuk ransomware, which is clearly must be something that is being leveraged by the likes of Lazarus Group. So it's very common at this stage now for us to, having started with a typical question and ending up with a ransomware, to completely shift our focus and then end up choosing to monitor Ryuk ransomware to see what it actually means from an actionable perspective. So if I spit out things like IP addresses and hash files that are associated to this malware, I can make a complete segue into my focus and actually add that to my, let's say, evolving list of IPs and hashes for my wider efforts around IOCs and so on and so forth. I guess we can make a slight segue here and ask the question of, how does Cyberbreaker know that these are IOCs in the first place? Because that's a pertinent question. We have these IOC feed providers. And then I guess a follow-up question is, can this be used instead of traditional IOC feed providers? The answer to the second part is, I'd say no, right? And I'll come back to that shortly. But in terms of why does Cyberbreaker use this, or how does Cyberbreaker know these are IOCs? We'll go to the next screen over here. The answer again is actually in the data itself. Here we can see that the #1 trending IP address from our last screen, I go back and bring it back to over here, we can see the evidence behind it. And this evidence is telling me that it is being used as part of a phishing attack targeting Microsoft Outlook. And on the right-hand side, we can see various other things like ASNs and which companies and what type of attack it's employing. So in this case, we can see spear phishing. So we know this is an IOC. Our evidence is telling us this, and we extend this to various other use cases as well, because technology does not discriminate. If threat actors are discussing among themselves in all of the sources that are being monitored, then eventually the human being will be able to see chatter around attacks and plans and so on and so forth. But technology is going to look at that immediately, and that's why we can provide you with the evidence. And the second question around whether or not this can replace traditional ICP providers, the reason why I say no is because no, it's a complement, right? Various reputable sources are out there, and they are very good at the sort of world of tips and SIEMs and so on and so forth. But these are our technological partners. We work with many SIEMs and we work with many threat intelligence platforms. What we provide in addition to that is, of course, context, because context is key in the world of intelligence. It is with context that we're able to look at something like a query around the geopolitical landscape and end up with a malware that is pertinent to our cyber security works. Because if you unstitch that, it's much more difficult to go the other way around. How do I take an IP address that is malicious and link that back to something like a Lazarus group by asking the question of, what is relevant to us in a geopolitical sphere? So no, everything is of course linked, everything is a complement, but the advantage of technology is visibility to it. And that's something that I'd actually like to demonstrate, because if I take that IP address now and put it into something like a virus total, for example, which is of course very, very well known and very common, we can actually take a sort of a result from it. And in the time that it's actually taken me to show you this example, we can see that at the time of making this slide, no other feed provider was able to actually pick up on this just yet. They'll get there eventually, but they will obviously need that visibility before they do so. Now, in the time it's taken me to show you this one example, the same technology has been scanning for countless things like this, derived from millions of documents, and identified from thousands of automated questions being asked on our behalf. And as a result of a handful of queries that actually impact our organization. And I think that's what we mean by facilitating intelligence professionals to, let's say, focus on the more pertinent aspects of threat intelligence and spend more time in the decision-making process than actually finding this information in the first place. And in conclusion, I guess what I'd like to say is that organizations that are sitting within their perimeter find it extremely difficult to understand the motivations behind threats. And that's really talking about the perimeter over here. But in the same way, organizations sitting on a geopolitical level find it even harder to identify the methodologies being used by threat actors as part of their attacks. So it's actually just as difficult as it is to go over this way. The example we used today was going this way, but there is nothing stopping me from flipping this example completely the other way around and starting with a malicious IP address and then finding the geopolitical content associated to it. It's actually easier to do that because I already have the results. I'm just trying to find what the results are, a question of how the question came up in the first place. So the tactical efforts of traditional threat intelligence are extremely necessary. But in addition to this, there is a layer of strategic intelligence and context that can only be found and gained from analysis of the unstructured web data. Threat intelligence teams must remain dynamic in order to keep up with the ever-changing requirements, responsibilities, and the developing threat landscape. So today, in addition, we actually also discussed the use of technology, because without it, the common questions that we ask and the solutions that we portray become quite obsolete and extremely difficult to scale up to meet these demanding requirements. Now, as companies continue to mature their threat intelligence programs, these requirements only become more comprehensive and complex in nature. Teams are faced with continuous and rapid demands to deliver insightful and actionable intelligence company-wide to the key stakeholders. Now, guys, technology will never replace the human efforts required to make these strategic decisions. I think we can all hope for that at the very least. But strategic decisions actually require actionable intelligence, something that we need to reach into the unstructured world for to begin with. And as part of this outreach, we can certainly leverage technology to get to that decision-making process much faster. We can apply this to any use case. The cyber use case is an obvious one because the facets that actually it comprises of are quite obvious to us, but identifying those links is what actually makes the difference. I'd like to thank you all for giving me this platform and being so attentive and allowing me to share my experiences with you. I'd like to open the floor up if there are any questions, or maybe Lisa, I can hand back to yourself, and we can take it from there. But thank you everyone for joining and giving me this platform. I appreciate your time a lot.
Thank you, Shah, for the informative session. So if anyone has any questions, you can ask from the chat option. So Shah, there's a question for you. What is the biggest change you've seen over time across cybersecurity customers that you've dealt with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest change is, I don't know if it's that cybersecurity is no longer an IT security problem, or the fact that that's actually now been widely accepted. It really is extending beyond that. And an example I have in mind is a project we worked on with a cyber team that was trying to find or trying to monitor things like the sort of news around the Houthi movement and in Yemen, in neighboring countries around that. And we were extremely excited, but also very curious as to why that was the case. Because this is where we saw a merging of departments and a cyber team focusing on something that is so obviously not cyber. We wanted to know a little bit more. So in our experience, what we found is that these teams are now looking beyond just their perimeter, right? And they need to do that in order to get the wider realm and understand what the wider connotations are, which is actually part of what we discussed today, a very large aspect of it. So this cross collaboration between all of these different departments is actually very interesting, and it's very great to see when you see things like financial crimes divisions or media monitoring teams, or let's say the fraud department of an organization asking questions to the cyber team, who are now very much at the front of a lot of at the forefront of a lot of these actions, and asking these questions regarding their business unit and getting responses from a cyber perspective. Because for the cyber professional, the connotations seem to be quite obvious, but if you're not in the cyber world, then it's not so obvious. So that collaboration is important. But to each individual within these different departments, the wider visibility is actually something that can only be achieved through collaboration. So in the effort of collaborating, the Houthi movement, by the way, was actually something that a cybersecurity team was monitoring, and they were doing it because they wanted to know about the civil unrest and the political instability in the area for the purpose of ensuring that they can report back to their stakeholders about whether it's actually advisable to have resources in that region. If you've invested a lot of money there, if you have people there, is it really worth spending or actually maintaining that, or is it a safety concern and maybe we should bring them back? So that collaboration has really shed light on the fact that cybersecurity today is no longer just an IT problem. And I guess more important to that is the acceptance of it. That's something that we really noticed over the last 4, 5, 6 years, I guess.
That's good. There's another question. So where do indicator feeds fit into what you've just talked about for today's session?
Yeah, and I think we alluded to the IOC world a little bit. And I guess in my experience talking to our customers, indicators are important, but they're not as useful without context. And this fits in nicely with one aspect of my presentation, where I address the difference between using something like a technology to generate IOCs versus relying on an IOC feed provider. They're both just as important, but the difference is with context, with the additional context, what you're able to actually do to the, let's say, traditional use case of tips, which is actually just providing these IOCs. One of the things that you can actually do is start doing investigation. And for that, you absolutely need to make use of context and unstructured data, because with that, you can start sort of getting lead-ons, right? And you can say, okay, well, this IP address has been used as part of this attack, and that attack is targeting this particular product or this organization or whatever. And if that's the case, then you can start unstitching, which is much like what we did in this presentation, and look at it from a more actionable and pivotable perspective. So that's something that we're actually trying to bring to the table, because traditional threat intelligence has actually entailed blocking IOCs like malicious IPs and so on and so forth, just at the firewall level. but you can't really go any further than that. So in any additional investigation actually requires that context, and the overall theme there then becomes a question of, are you a security team that actually looks to prevent threats, or are you the one that mitigates threats? And if you are just dealing with RCP providers, then yes, very easily you can have an automated system that goes ahead and actually blocks access to malicious IPs, for example. But if you want to, and that is very much a mitigating aspect of threat intelligence. But threat intelligence today just simply isn't that. By definition, it's about investigating, it's about understanding, it's about looking at TTPs and so on and so forth. And that connection, being able to make that jump and being able to make that pivot, requires that context, which you'll only really find in the unstructured world. And that's why we apply our own technology to it, because then you can say, okay, well, this ransomware is the reason behind this IP address being malicious, or this malware is something that we need to pay attention to, and then linking that back to a threat actor that leverages that malware and then uses certain attack types to do it. So should we now focus on that malicious IP address or that vulnerability, or should we actually focus on making sure that our organization is more protected against a specific attack type? Because then that will kill a lot of birds with one stone. Or what about if we are better suited to dealing with this particular threat actor? And if we can do that, then why not be better? Why not actually protect ourselves against a group of threat actors? So closing these doors really to attacks is the difference, I think, between using unstructured data, and the indicators fit in at the very beginning of that process and are very necessary, because if you remember in one of my slides, I spoke about the difficulties associated with going from the very geographical to the very granular. In this case, as cybersecurity professionals, you have the answer at the very, very end anyway. We're just trying to find what that main question was at the beginning. So we need those indicator feeds for sure. But the additional context that we can apply to it using unstructured data is something that in no way can be ignored anymore.
Thank you, Shah. I think that's all the questions asked. So thank you very much, Shah, for joining us today and giving us such an informative session. So if anybody wants to ask more questions about today's session and wants to know more about Silobreaker, you can email Shah, or you can also go to Logon's website and we will answer all your inquiries. So thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you everyone from Silobreaker as well.